This lesson is going to be all about loops and iteration using JavaScript in order to do a for loop, do while loop, and break and continue that are available within the loops. So what JavaScript loops do is they allow you to run multiple iterations and you can set the parameters. One thing to avoid with loops is infinite loops. You don't want them to be able to loop forever. That will crash the browser. So always make sure that you have a way out of your loop. And that's the purpose of the loop, is to constantly increment values or numbers and then find a way out of the loop. So once a condition is met, so for instance, this is a for loop, and we've got a counter. While that counter is less than 5, it will continue. And then once that condition is no longer true, the loop will break. And this is true for all the loops. So as you're iterating through the content of a loop, you also have an option to break the loop. So you have an ability to set a condition to break out of the loop. So the break will stop the loop. There's also one that's called continue, true, and then we continue. Although this one is not commonly used, it is available, but it's not advised because you might run into some problems with testing. So there is a challenge for this lesson, and that's to create a loop of a counter using all 3 different iteration options. So we've got the for loop, we've got the while loop, and as well the do while loop. There's an example of them. So these are all going to output the same thing. So each loop has a starting point. So setting the counter to 0, we're looping while the counter is less than 5. And we also need a way to increase the counter. So the counter is incrementing by 1. So this gives us our way out of the loop. So we've got our starting point as well within the while loop, where we're setting x to 0 while x is less than 5. And then we're incrementing x within the while. As well, we've got the do while loop. So we're checking we're setting the value of I to 0. We're incrementing I with 1. And then we're doing this while I is less than 5. So first, let's create the most common loop. So this is the for loop. And this is the one that you're going to encounter the most. So setting up our counter at 0. This is our starting point for the counter. And then next is the condition that we want to meet. So we want to loop this while counter is less than 5. And then we need a way out. So we need something different. We need counter updating. So that's where we've just got that counter updating, incrementing by 1. And this will give us our way out. And I'll just write for loop and then also add in the value of counter just after that. So take a look in the console, and we see it starts at 0. So this is our starting value. We can start it at 1 as well. So that will start at 1, 2, 3, 4. And then we can loop while counter is less than 6. So that means that it's going to break after 5. So that was one example. The other example is this is a while loop. So let's set our starting point. So using x as our starting point, we're going to loop while x is less than 5. And then this is where the block of code goes. Always make sure that you're incrementing x, because this is, again, our way out of the loop. And this is our while loop. And then we can see the value of x. And depending on what you're trying to accomplish with your coding, you may prefer to use one looping method over the other. And also keep in mind that wherever we're placing the x increment, that's going to affect the value of x at the time we're running the code. So if we're placing it before or after, it will make a difference within the output. And then lastly, let's do one last loop, and this is the do while loop. So this is very similar to the while loop, and there is actually one important difference. So let's set it up and we'll run through it, and then I'll show you what the difference here is. So within the console log, so this is the do while, and adding in the value of I so that we can see it. And then the condition that's going to break this loop is while I is less than 5. So let's try that, and you can see that the result is the same thing, where if we do the increment of I afterwards, it's going to work the same way as the while loop. So the difference here is that if the starting values for the while loop are 10 and for the do while loop are 10, you're going to see one interesting difference, and that means that the do while loop always runs at least one time, whereas the while loop, because this condition isn't met, it never runs this block of code because the value of x is 10. So if you need to run it at least one time, then you can use a do while loop. Otherwise, you could just use a while loop, or if you prefer, you can use a for loop. So do try out all three.